going to talk about my own mythic, mythopoetic system as a manifestation of the cathartic orientation towards art that I'm discussing during this decade. I just realized I'm not sure how to pronounce the word mythopoetic. Anyway, I should look that up. But I don't think everyone who listens to liturgy necessarily knows that in tandem with the music and in tandem with my system of ideas, there is a kind of mythos, which I've only really fully integrated once in the origin of the Alimony's record. So without really getting into the content of what's in the mythos, but just to briefly actually say that before I even finish that thought, there are a number of characters, and they're kind of divine beings, and they are concerned with world history, and the relationships with each other. And the idea is that this mythos it's like an attempt to give an answer to the question of the origin of all things, or generally it's an effort to sort of be a horizon, to sort of be a cultural horizon, basically. That there's no real difference in kind between the mythos that I'm developing, which is clearly fiction in a way, but not exactly, because it's kind of channeled, and the kind of larger cultural horizon of sort of stories and narratives that we tell ourselves about history and why the world is the way that it is, the way that it has to be, that it is, and what's possible and what isn't possible. And I guess a central point that I would make here is that the capacity to invent these horizons, which are, neither truth nor fiction exactly, but they're a kind of blooming of a kind of power. It's a really wonderful human capacity, and it's one that I endorse. It's also a dangerous one, and that's a big dialectic right now. What's the difference between my truth and the truth? Shouldn't there be some standard? So to step back, I guess this kind of goes back to metaphysics. I would say you could deny this too, but I would say that there is a fundamental question that afflicts every human being, that takes the form of something like, why are things the way that they are? And what makes it metaphysical, this question, is that it's impossible to categorize it. It's impossible to sort of say what type of question it is, and it applies to all kinds of different things. And part of the question is how do you categorize things? That was really abstract. So concretely, what I mean is it can be why is there space? why is there time? Why is there the government? Why is there gender? Why is there death? Why is there sex? These questions it's difficult to categorize them. Why is there time? That seems like a question that is more physical than cultural or social. I think, but it's not totally clear. Whereas why is there the government is definitely more of a cultural or social question, maybe, but maybe not, right? Like there's, you can believe that a particular form of government is divinely mandated, or that there's no possibility of the current kind of power regime changing. I think people in the United States really feel that acutely, that like it was only until the past couple of years, the dominance of the United States felt like a fact that was like as fixed as like the fact that the sun rises, and like now it's like, oh, these institutions actually could be overthrown, or the dominance of the country could shrink, or whatever. And that's, I would say, I think that's a really good definition of metaphysical, that it's like a questioning that is, it can't be categorized, and as soon as you start categorizing it, you start giving an answer. You're like, oh, okay, well, over here there's the physical side or the logical side of like, being, nothingness, identity, space, time. Over here, this is, the body and gender and sexuality, and over here is like civil society and economics, and you start kind of cordoning things off. But usually if you're doing that, it's more arbitrary than it seems, and it's probably interested in some way too. Like depending on your angle, you'll decide, that time is social versus logical, or you'll decide that, I don't know, free speech is a human versus a metaphysical ideal or something. So the question persists, and I guess point number 2 is that like there's this phrase like man is a theological being, or man is a metaphysical being, that like we are taught by society to give up this question of either handing it over to the experts or deciding that it's too hard or it's not important enough, and to kind of that doing that closes off a certain potential to be free and to be creative, and you don't have to actually close off the question. Like you don't have to be humiliated out of asking it. It's always humiliation and shaming and threats that gets you to stop asking. It's not because you found an answer. So my system of the origin of the alimonies is an attempt to provide an answer to that question that is constructed as a patchwork of a couple of different theological and philosophical orientations, but there's a real like creative dimension to it, where like I kind of spend time writing like dramatic vignettes to take place between figures like Olalan and Sem, or between Kal Valhal and Raina Ray and Genesis Call. And those are really the main ones, actually, those five. And this is kind of the most underdeveloped or least developed aspect of my practice, to be perfectly candid about it. But it's one that I can sense is kind of picking up more. So this will, I don't know, be of more interest to people maybe when I'm actually doing it more. But the album and film Origin of the Alimonies was an instance of presenting this this myth, and the myth is archetypal, right? It sort of is a structure, and then all kinds of quests or dramatic vignettes, or full. I guess that's kind of my idea, is that I would be sort of doing full feature length, like animated operas or something like that, where sequences of events are playing out between these characters, and the music kind of sounds like liturgy, and I'm designing it visually, and that's what I've been moving towards for a long time, but I haven't released really any of that, or not much of it. So yeah, maybe that's where I'll stop for now. And really the archetype, like the people who I really look to in this style of art making are William Blake and Richard Wagner. So to some people, those two figures are such obviously great artists and famous artists that it's almost cringe to invoke them as being great or as being an influence, a little bit like what I was saying about David Lynch in a previous video. But to others, not everyone knows who Richard Wagner is. Lots of people don't. I know people who don't. And certainly most people don't explore the worlds that the two of those figures created in depth. Blake was much more of a poet, but Blake was much more of a wordsmith and like narrative visionary than Wagner was. So, the main thing for him was these stories that sort of all go back to the same group of characters, and very influenced by Gnosticism and Christianity, but really he puts his own spin on it, and the stories are illuminated, so there's images as well, prints that he etched and colored in. And what's kind of amazing about Blake is, and is apocalyptic. It's about the apocalypse, but it's also sort of really situating that in his present context. He's very interested in the American Revolution, which is happening, and sort of how that plays out, and the task of England, and that kind of thing. Wagner, I guess he had one cluster of operas that were all in the same world. The Ring Cycle, which is 4 operas, and there's this very long story that plays out that is kind of there's no attempt for it to be like a really original thing. It's based on Norse myth, but he's definitely kind of cherry picking and changing things to match his ideals. But he has lots of operas that are all kind of archetypal in this same way, in the sense that he's intending for them to create a horizon of meaning, to really transform people's souls and kind of give them a compass for their lives. But they're all drawn from pre-existing myths. Even though he wrote his librettos himself, so his other big one is Parsifal, which comes from a myth. That's and then Tristan and Isolde is also a myth. And I mean, I guess that's, I mean, my system directly invokes some of Blake's characters, particularly Olalan, who's a very minor character of his, and Urizen, who's a major character of his. And I guess that's because my approach is sort of a combination of Blake's and Wagner's approach, where I'm interested in creating a unique myth system, but also in referring back to pre-existing ones. And now at this point, Blake's system is one of those. Like the figure of Urizen. Actually, I think I have. I have a book. There's that, probably his most famous image is this like sun, and then Urizen is this white bearded god who's looking down, and then he points, kind of measure, his body is kind of close off and hunched, and he's pointing this measuring implement sort of onto the world. What was I saying about it? Oh yeah, that's sort of achieved the status of a myth at this point. Jesus Christ, the story of Jesus Christ, just to be clear, I always feel like it's worth saying, I don't think that's a myth. I think that was a real event, that Christ was as real as Blake himself, whereas Urizen is a myth. And yeah, this is probably the last video on this topic of cathartic art. And so I guess one last thing I'll say is that, so we'll be transitioning into the art from the Cardinal of Fervor in the next decan. And yeah, and my attempt to operate in that mode. Most of my sculptural work is more related to fervor, although it does contain characters from my mythos in it. But a huge interest of mine is combining these two regimes. And it's not something that really anyone ever does, but it should be possible, I think. And a great reference for distinguishing between these two regimes is Deleuze's book on cinema. He has one thought, the movement image, and one thought, the time image. And he sees those as two modes of cinema, but they're really modes of aesthetics in a kind of wider context too. And I think you can do both, and that you should, and actually need to be adequate to the current social horizon, historical horizon.